we're ready to get started. So I'll introduce myself first for y'all. So my name is Grania, and I have been working with the Creative Centenaries project to help bring these events together over the past few months. I'll be here all evening, so if anyone has any questions about the project or this event specifically, please ask away in the chat and I'll do my best to answer. So first and foremost, I would like to say a really big thank you to everyone who's come along to this event tonight. It's great to see so many names at the second of this series of events by Creative Centenaries, reflecting on the past 100 years of Northern Ireland. So this event's following on from last month's Sexuality in Ireland event. If you missed that, you can catch that on our website, and we'll also be sharing a recording of tonight's event too, if you'd like to rewatch, or if you know of anyone that wasn't able to come along tonight to watch live. Secondly, I would also like to extend a massive thank you to all of our speakers for what will no doubt be a really stimulating set of talks and hopefully a discussion toward the end too. And to the chair for tonight, Dr Ryan Mallon, for helping to organise. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to our partners at the Nerve Centre, the Centenary Historical Advisory Panel, and also our project's funding body, the National Lottery Shared History Fund. As I said just a moment ago, we would really like to encourage a discussion at the end of the talks. So if you have any questions throughout the event, please do pop them in the Q&A chat. As well as this, everyone should get an email from Eventbrite later on tonight asking you to fill out a post-event evaluation form, and we would really appreciate if everyone just took 2 minutes to fill out this form and let us know how we did. And also, really importantly, it gives you a chance to tell us if the event was helpful or interesting in any way, any new facts you learned, and what you'd like to see from us in the future, which is really important. So that's all from me, I think. So I'll just introduce our chair for the night, Dr Ryan Mallon, and then you can take it away. So Dr Mallon completed his PhD at Queen's, Belfast in 2018, and he's currently a teaching associate in the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at the university. His research focuses on religion, politics and identity in Scotland, and he has published articles on Scottish nationalism, education, anti-Catholicism and radical politics. Dr Mallon's also recently published his first book in June of this year, titled Dissent After Disruption. And as well as this, Ryan's also been working with Creative Centenaries over the past wee while, and he's done some really, really great digital content, which you can find over on our website, some blogs, and some focus on pieces as well. So that's all from me. I'll pass the mic on over to Ryan, and we can let the talks begin.
Thanks very much, Grania, for organising this and for introducing everybody. It's great to have you all along to this event. So many of you, thanks for signing up, and I hope you enjoy the discussion tonight. And as Grania said, make sure to put in your questions throughout each of the speakers, during each of the talks, and then we can have a bit of a discussion at the end of it. So, as I saw in last week's Centenary Church service in Armagh, religion never really seems too far away when discussing Northern Ireland, and especially the Centenary this year. However, religion, especially when placed in the context of partition, is often viewed simply as a marker for other political, cultural and ethno-national identifiers. Something that was summed up quite plainly by the first Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Craig, in 1934, when he famously described the Northern Ireland state as a Protestant state and the then Irish Free State as a Catholic one. And those kind of distinctions were also evident, of course, within Northern Ireland between the Unionist, mostly Protestant community and the Nationalist, mostly Catholic community. However, as we will explore tonight with our panel, it's important to view these developments within Christianity in their own right and not just reduce them to the constitutional question. So we'll be asking, how does belief and practice affect all aspects of life in Northern Ireland since 1921? How are they affected by broader trends in Christianity, and how do these change over time? So from the partition era of 1921 to the COVID era of 2021. To discuss all these things and more, I'm delighted to be joined by a brilliant panel of speakers, Professor Crawford Gribben, Dr Gladys Ganiel and Dr Andrew Holmes. So as I mentioned, please put your questions into the chat throughout, and we'll be able to discuss all of these at the end of the 3 talks. So first up, we're going to go to Professor Crawford Gribben. So Crawford is an historian of early modern religion in the School of History, Anthropology, Politics and Philosophy at Queen's. His work mostly focuses on the development and dissemination of religious ideas in the literary cultures of Puritanism and evangelicalism. His latest book, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, charts quite predictably by its title the emergence, long dominance, sudden division and recent decline of Ireland's most important religion. And tonight he will be discussing how religion developed in the 26 counties after the partition in 1921.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen now. And hopefully that has come up. And you can see a slideshow. Good. Thank you very much to Ryan and to Ganiel for the invitation to be here today, and for Ganiel for doing so much work behind the scenes and making that possible. Really appreciate that. Today we got some news that our academic pension fund is likely to face some challenging times. So if you'd like to show your solidarity with persecuted academics, it's a very practical way you can do that. There's a very attractive book that lots of people in your family and friendship circle would really value for Christmas. The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland. Well, partition is something that causes strong feelings, of course, and whether we think it was bad for the island or not, we can certainly agree that it was bad for the dog who gets caught in the middle of that line, dividing 6 counties from 26 counties in 1921 as the Northern Ireland and what became the Free State and Republic began to develop in the years following. 2 jurisdictions whose success was made possible by rival religious nationalisms. I'm really interested in thinking about these rival religious nationalisms and the way in which they picked up speed in the middle of the 19th century through revivals, religious and political and cultural revivals that took place among Catholics through the devotional revolution and with the impact of urbanisation and new urban parish structures in cities like Belfast, of course, but also the ways in which a similar kind of phenomenon was obvious among Protestants. Again, the mid-19th century religious revival, evangelical revival, often associated with the year 1859 and the years that followed, and the ways in which that religious revival provided Irish Protestants with a common political as well as a common religious identity. In some respects, the revival of 1859 plays a role for Irish Protestants. It's very similar to the role that was played by the Great Awakening in the American colonies in the 1730s, in which widely dispersed individuals, families, communities that often had very little in common with each other found themselves being provided with a common language, a religious language, a sense of religious community, and a sense of almost millennial aspiration that allowed that community 40 years later to take part in a revolutionary war against British power with the beginnings of American independence. And in some ways, religion, religious revival, with the same kind of timescale of a 40, 50-year timescale among Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, is doing the same kind of thing from the middle of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. In the 26 counties, the devotional revolution, cultural nationalism and political nationalism made possible the formation of a Christian state. You can see there the very famous picture by Sir John Lavery, The Blessing of the Colours, a picture which hangs still in Dublin, which describes the moment when the flag of the new southern jurisdiction was brought into the Pro-Cathedral in Dublin for blessing by the Catholic Archbishop of that city. After partition, the Catholic Church played an incredibly important role in the southern jurisdiction because, along with the GAA, it was one of very few institutions that had the capacity to bridge the divisions between pro and anti-treaty forces that were developing through that period. And we know that this created an opportunity for a large number of Catholic activists who saw this as a chance really to mould a state and to mould a culture according to the conclusions of some of the most recent Catholic social theory. We tend to call these organisations Catholic action organisations. They were up to speed, they were up to date with some of the most recent arguments of Catholic social theorists. And their ambition really was to create a Christian polity in the 26 counties that made sense of the Church's hostility both to communism and to capitalism. And the new organisations that came up to articulate the Church's critique of both of those economic positions were often arguing for something quite distinct in between. For many people, of course, the new state in the South was not sufficiently Christian. And a number of prominent denominational polemicists published a large body of work, a large and quite influential body of work, to argue for agendas that were specifically denominational. So Father Denis Fahey, for example, in his book, The Kingship of Christ, in 1931, took a key idea in Christian history, the idea that Christ is king, and used that really as the basis for quite a wide-ranging discussion of the ways in which the royal power, the kingly power of Christ, ought to be reflected in the state's institutions and in the culture that they promoted. Perhaps even more influentially, Father Edward Cahill published a book called The Framework of the Christian State in 1932, a book that, incidentally, you can still buy on Amazon for a couple of pounds in a very attractive reprint. And Cahill's Framework of the Christian State really set out an incredibly ambitious attempt to think through all the aspects of state policy, from the way in which states should support families to education and so on, with a rigorously, almost hyper version of Catholic social theory that suggested, for example, that marriages between Protestants should be seen as legalized concubinage rather than as an expression of a sacramental state, the married state that the Church and the state recognised. So in the 1920s, 1930s, some agendas were specifically denominational. Other agendas were much more ecumenical. Canon John Hayes founded Munchen Achira, 1937, which, as the name suggests, was a kind of a rural countryside kind of organisation that sought to draw a much more, I suppose, much gentler version of Catholic social theory into rural association, into rural movements to promote community, good agricultural practice, and so on. And Hayes, of course, travelled widely and sought to draw his international learning into the ways in which Munchen Achira began to develop. But other organisations were much more ambitious while retaining that kind of Christian ecumenism. Altír na Hashira, founded in 1942 by Gearóid Ó Cunaigán, was a right-wing Irish language party that was specifically Christian in its orientation. It was fairly successful through, I suppose, until the late 1940s, and certainly several of its members came into positions of some influence. For all it was a far-right Irish language party that insisted that upon that one of the results of their electoral success would be within 5 years the banning of English as an official language of the country, so that the culture would be renewed in its Gaelic commitments, in order that Irish young people would be protected from the tsunami of American cultural influence that the members of Altír thought was really attacking the basis of Catholic culture in Ireland. But, you know, it was a fascist party. There's some really interesting documentary work on TG Cahir, which explores the ways in which the party was really trying to fashion itself as something which would introduce a new kind of politics, but was also a party that may have promoted Europe's most prominent Methodist fascist. But all of these questions, the question as to whether the new state was sufficiently Christian, the question as to whether it was sufficiently committed to Catholic social theory, of course raised the big concern that W.B. Yeats raised in one Senate debate. The question as to whether Southern Protestants would be a petty people. And in the early years, the first couple of decades of the Southern jurisdiction, that seemed to be a very live issue. Efforts were made in the first Senate towards religious inclusion. The members of that Senate were nominated, but it was composed of 36 Catholics, 20 Protestants, 3 Quakers and a Jew. In other words, the nominated membership of the first Senate really gave an opportunity for the state's religious minorities to find a very distinct political voice. Of course, that kind of religious distribution was not sustained when membership of the Senate was determined by election rather than by nomination. We get another sense of the tension between exclusion and exclusion in the 1937 Constitution, which recognised famously the special status of the Catholic Church among the several religious communities that existed at the formation of the state. And while that seemed both to recognise the reality of the power of the Catholic Church and the loyalty to the Catholic Church of a huge majority of the new state's population, it also served to exclude smaller religious communities, such as the very small Jewish community, mostly in Dublin, as the Constitution began with that very famous invocation of the Trinity, as if the Irish people had always depended upon Jesus Christ to save them in their distress. Another example of the tension between exclusion and inclusion came with the appointment of Douglas Hyde as the first president of the Free State in 1938. When he died in 1949, as you'll see there from that still, from an old Pahe newsreel, you'll see that his colleagues in government, including De Valera, would not attend the Anglican service for his funeral, but stood respectfully outside. And I think that's a really interesting moment at Hyde's funeral in 1949, because it gives us a real sense of the otherness of the Southern States Protestant community, even though its members had access to the highest appointments in the country. But De Valera's imagination of Ireland, especially in his famous speech, "The Ireland that we dream of," valorised rural piety and content. I wonder how many of the people who listened to this speech on the radio in 1943 felt as they heard De Valera narrate a really beautiful description of a life that many of them had never realised. De Valera imagined Ireland as the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit, a land whose countryside would be bright with cosy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youths, the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age. Ireland, De Valera imagined, would be the home of a people living the life that God desires that men should live. But there was an alternative way of understanding that speech. For some people who were listening to that, the state was simply too liberal. It's very striking in 1950 when the government health minister proposed that state institutions, state hospitals, should begin to look after pregnant women and new mothers in the mother and child scheme, that doctors, general practitioners, reacted very strongly against this and found the support of bishops who were concerned that the state was beginning to impose its will on the separate sphere of medical care, a sphere which they thought really belonged to them. So for some, the state was too liberal. For others, the state was too conservative. And if any of us have read Paul Smith's extremely difficult and moving novel, The Countrywoman, published in 1961, you'll have some sense of the horror that could be endured by those who found themselves stuck in marriages that the state and church refused to see dissolved. Of course, as we look at De Valera's speech there and the romping of sturdy children around firesides that are the forum for the wisdom of serene old age, we need to remember that many of those sturdy children in 1943 were well on the path of becoming the CEOs of the Celtic Tiger, when Ireland would not obviously be the home of a people who valued material wealth, as De Valera put it, only as a basis for right living. But what of Protestants? Well, as you'll see from the stats at the bottom there, the Protestant community in what became the Republic rapidly declined. In the 1911 census, around 10% of the population, 311,000 people, registered as Protestant. By 1991, which is the period I'm sort of winding up at in this presentation, that number had really collapsed to 1/3 of that original total, and that even as the population of the state was beginning to climb again, from 10% down to 3%. What caused the sudden and quite spectacular collapse of the Protestant population? Well, we know that during the mid-20th century, well, from the early into the mid-20th century, Irish Protestants faced sometimes significant challenges. Civil War outrages, famously at Dunmanway, Cork in 1922, were followed by isolated instances of boycotts. Interestingly, in some of those boycotts, the IRA intervened to secure and protect Protestant rights. The most famous boycott happened in Fethard-on-Sea in 1957, and that boycott of Protestants, which was organised by the local parish priest, was supported by the Bishop of Galway, but criticised by De Valera. And so I think it's no surprise that Protestants found themselves often quite isolated in the southern estate. Bishops prohibited students from the Dublin diocese from entering Trinity College Dublin from 1944, and bishops nationally from 1956 prohibited their students from attending Trinity. And that ban was only lifted in 1970. The Protestant community and its institutions were being othered. But things were beginning to change. In 1961, fully 95% of the population identified as Roman Catholic. In 1979, when John Paul II celebrated outdoor Mass in Phoenix Park in Dublin, over 1.25 million people attended and took part in that event. Was that the high point of Christian Ireland, or was it merely its tipping point? Well, I think it's very significant that the papal visit in 1979 was followed by attempts to copper fasten the Catholic ethos of the state. In 1983, the first abortion referendum, which was pushed forward by activists, really without much support from the Catholic hierarchy, secured the equal right to life in the constitution of mothers and their unborn children. That led, one commentator suggested, to the second partitioning of Ireland, in which urban and rural communities began to diverge. The first divorce referendum in 1986 returned a slightly smaller majority that was voting to defend Catholic social teaching in state legislation. But things were changing too. Contraception was made available in pharmacies for the first time in 1980, and from 1985, contraception was available without a doctor's prescription. And what that meant was that Irish Catholics, outwardly faithful to the Church, could begin to make private decisions about the Church's teachings on sexual ethics. Since 1961, the proportion of those identifying as Catholic has continued to decline, down to 78% in 2016, which is the lowest census return. And yet in 2018, in that community in which 78% of people identified as Catholic, only 10% of those who turned out to see Pope John Paul II turned out to see Pope Francis in another open-air Mass in Phoenix Park. How did that happen? Well, we'll cut across to Gladys to find out more in due course.
Thank you, Crawford. That was a really interesting introduction to the first 70 years of post-partition life in the 26 counties of Ireland, of the Republic of Ireland. So next, we're going to shift the focus to north of the border, and we will go to Dr. Andrew Holmes. So Andrew is a reader in history at the School of History, Anthropology, Politics and Philosophy at Queen's, and his work focuses on the history of Protestantism, mainly Presbyterians, evangelicals, and the relationship between religion and identity. In 2018, he published with Oxford University Press, The Irish Presbyterian Mind, a study of Presbyterian identity and theological life between 1830 and 1930. And he has recently completed a fascinating study on popular Protestantism and fundamentalism in Ulster. Tonight, he'll be discussing developments between the creation of Northern Ireland due to the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 and will lead up to the 1990s like Crawford. As usual, keep your questions coming and we can go to them at the end and discuss them all together as a panel. So, take it away, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. Let me see if I can get the technology to work here. It's lovely to be back virtually in Derry, at least. McGee College gave me my first job many years ago, so I always have a soft spot for the Northwest, and it's lovely to be talking to you this evening. What I want to do in this presentation is just to give a sort of a general overview of some of the themes that we might want to think about if we're thinking about religion in Northern Ireland from about 1921 through to 1991. And I suppose one of the first things to mention is that Northern Ireland, of course, religion matters and has mattered over the last century. And even today, there's greater religious commitment in Northern Ireland compared to other parts of the UK. And there's also greater denominational diversity compared with the south of Ireland. Even today, and Gladys will talk more about this in the presentation after this, organised Christianity remains strong despite the growth of other world faiths and also of the category of no religion in the census. So religion has always mattered in Northern Ireland since partition. But it's striking that when it comes to the historical study of this period, there's actually been a remarkable lack of interest in religion amongst historians. This is partly to do with the fact that the social and cultural history of Northern Ireland between about 1921 1968-70 hasn't really been touched. It's also, I think, a product of what one historian has called the tyranny of the national question in Northern Ireland, that religion is defined primarily in terms of political allegiance and political identity. And I think underlying that sense that religion is made something which is explained away by the national question is this idea that normal Western societies, whatever they are, religion isn't important in those societies, but yet it is here. So there must be something strange or weird about Northern Ireland that makes it different to other parts of Western Europe, because the assumption is that modern societies should be secular. And as a consequence of that, religion in Northern Ireland is often explained away by reference to the national question. And the anthropologist Clifford Geertz has famously said that religion is everyone's favourite dependent variable. In other words, religion has always been explained by something else and is never really the focus of study. And what I want us to think about in this presentation is the relationship between religion and identity. Yes, Protestant Unionist versus Catholic Nationalist, but I also want to try and suggest other ways that we could maybe think about the religious history of Northern Ireland that isn't made subservient by the national question. So, Protestant Unionist versus Catholic Nationalist is obviously a major way that we can think about religion in Northern Ireland from 1921. The scholarly consensus, generally speaking, is that the Northern Ireland conflict isn't a religious conflict, but yet religion does help define and organise the two communities. Whenever we're thinking about partition in particular, none of the four main churches, at least in public, wanted partition. But yet, over the course of the Stormont years in particular, there was a clear Protestant Unionist versus Catholic Nationalist divide. Patrick Mitchell has talked about the cocoon complacency of the Protestant churches under the Stormont regime. And of course, the significance of Ian Paisley has been widely commented upon and underlines the close connection, it seems, between Unionist politics and evangelical religion. At the same time, the Catholic Church in Northern Ireland was very much associated with nationalism. The view of Stormont ministers that the Catholic community were some kind of rebellious fifth column wasn't really borne out by the fact that the overwhelming majority of Catholics in the first decades of the Stormont regime were committed constitutional nationalists. So Protestant Unionist versus Catholic Nationalist is an incredibly important part of the historical experience of Northern Ireland. And it feeds into, of course, in many ways, the Northern Ireland original sin of sectarianism, which, according to Cecilia Clegg and Joseph Lichty in their influential study Moving Beyond Sectarianism, is a distorted expression of positive human need. In other words, it focuses on important things which all human beings want, of sense of belonging, of identity, of free expression, of difference. But in the Northern Ireland context, it has been distorted and warped in the context of those conflicts over the years. Certainly, sorry, I went on there a bit quickly. Certainly, since the 1960s, the churches, at least at a leadership level, have been trying to create some kind of distance between religion and identity. That has been a very fitful process. It hasn't been an easy process. And I suppose that the question that still surrounds the role of the churches in Northern Ireland, expressed during the service last week, is the extent to which churches can act as agents of reconciliation. So it's clear that Protestant unionist versus Catholic nationalist is a reality of our historical and shared experience. But I think there are ways that we can challenge those monoliths, if you like, of Protestant unionist on one hand and Catholic nationalist on the other hand. Sociologists and social scientists of Northern Ireland have shown that there's actually a weak relationship between political attitudes and strongly held religious beliefs and behaviours. So in other words, those who are more likely to go to church are maybe less likely to hold extreme political views. In a wonderful study undertaken in the early 1990s, Fred Bowl, Margaret Keane and David Livingstone wrote a report called Them and Us, which was published in 1997 about churchgoers in Belfast. And the one thing which united Protestants and Catholics, according to that study, was the perception of each group that the other was more cohesive and represented a negation of their political aspirations. So in other words, it was more what actually the perception of the other that mattered in terms of creating a coherent Protestant and Catholic identity. What their study actually showed was that when it came to Catholics, there was a whole range of attitudes towards doctrinal and moral issues that varied according to age and educational attainment. The same pattern of variation was also observed amongst Protestants as well. The denominational variation, that Protestants are divided into different churches, was exacerbated by tensions between so-called liberals and conservatives within the churches, and also by class and age. So if the monolith of Protestant unionists and Catholic nationalists is primarily about perception of the other, are there potential ways that we could maybe think about religion in Northern Ireland over the course of the last 100 years in different ways? And from that perspective, I think there are probably three areas where we could actually say, take a step back from the constitutional question and actually think about how we could put the religious back into the religious history of Northern Ireland. The first is obviously religious practice. The clergy and religious have provided not only religious services, but social services and all sorts of pastoral support over the past 100 years. But yet we know remarkably little about the collective background of these individuals, about their training, about their outlook on life. We know remarkably little about how ordinary people practiced their religion, how ordinary people thought about God, and how that relationship affected their relationships with others. Gender is an incredibly important aspect of this. If it wasn't for women, organised religion would have been ground into the dirt a long time ago. We really need to think seriously about female involvement in religious belief and practice. But we also need to think about how men are understood and constructed in that context as well. We can think about the history of interdenominational associations amongst Protestants, those that promoted evangelism, like the Port Stewart Convention and the Faith Mission, those that promoted student witness, the Student Christian Movement, the Christian Union of Queens, or indeed work amongst children and young people, like Scripture Union. We could think about Catholic organisations like the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association, the Knights of St. Columbanus, the Legion of Mary, and the sodality of the holy name. These things matter to people's lives outside of the constitutional question and need to be considered. We also need to think about how religion in Northern Ireland and the churches responded to the opportunities and stresses of the modern world, from the Great Depression in the 1930s up until the youth counterculture of the 1960s. Certainly after 1945, all of the Christian denominations in Northern Ireland underwent institutional and bureaucratic expansion. The Catholic Church erected a significant number of church buildings in the late 1940s. In 1948, a Cistercian monastery was established at Portglenone, and a Servite Priory at Benburb the following year. After 1945, the Presbyterian Church set up 40 new congregations and added youth fellowships and youth clubs to its religious services for children. One of the first attempts to bring together Catholic and Protestant clergy was actually the Church's Industrial Council in Belfast in 1961, which brought the clergy together to help mediate on labour disputes. The third element that we might think about in terms of putting religion back into the religious history of Northern Ireland is the significance of global religious networks. All of the Christian churches in Northern Ireland support the extension of Christianity overseas through foreign mission. This is something which historians and sociologists have spent very little time examining, but it's absolutely crucial if we're to understand gender roles within church and also the legacies of colonialism as well. The Catholic Global Religious Network, of course, was seen in Vatican II, whenever Cardinal Conway and also William Philbin attended the council. Evangelical networks have been particularly important since the 1950s, and it's important to remember that Ian Paisley may have had a loud voice, but he didn't represent most, if not the clear majority of evangelicals who did not join his Free Presbyterian Church. If we think about Christianity today, we think about Pentecostalism in the so-called two-thirds world. Evangelicalism is on the march, and we need to think about those networks. So, in terms of bringing this together, some things may seem not to have changed over the past 100 years, but things have changed. In 1921, there was often a subconscious assumption that religion and identity were very close together. The fact that today in Northern Ireland, many people are questioning the relationship between Protestantism and Unionism, Catholicism and nationalism, I think is a significant development. But in terms of the religious history of Northern Ireland, the differences within churches have been as important, and at certain times more so, than differences between them. And certainly in terms of today's tensions in terms of religion, society in Northern Ireland, the division between so-called liberals and conservatives, between those who want to engage and those who don't want to engage with broader issues, I think is very significant. And at this point, I will stop talking, you'll be glad to know, and I will hand over to Dr. Gladys Ganiel, who's going to talk to you a bit more about the so-called conservative term and whether there is secularization in modern Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Right, hello, Ryan. I'll assume you're ready just for me to jump right in there. I'm Gladys Ganiel, and I'm a reader in sociology at Queen's. And I'm going to be talking about Christianity on the whole island of Ireland in broadly the present. So picking up where Crawford and Andrew have sort of left off and bringing us up hopefully to the present day. So the content of the presentation, I'm going to show you a few figures that will go through decline and persistence, the quantitative measures, and also some qualitative research that's been done. I'll talk about some of the contextual factors that have contributed to this, I suppose, process of secularization that's been mentioned already. And then I'll conclude with some reflections about the future as well. So this is a slide that shows you religious identification in the Republic of Ireland between 1961 and 2016. So I just want people to get a broad sense. You know, decline has already been mentioned, but if you look at the top bar, you know, 1961, 95% of people in the Republic of Ireland are identifying as Catholic. It's 78% in 2016. You can kind of see that steady decline. What I want to draw your attention to is the no religion growth towards the bottom of the graph. So less than 0.5% in 1961, up to about 10% in 2016. And a lot of commentators think that figure would be a lot higher if the question on the census was asked in a slightly different way. So they're asked, what is your religion? Kind of assuming you have a religion, but there are other ways to ask that question. And I sort of agree with this as well. We would probably be getting a higher rate of people identifying as no religion if the question was asked differently, which it will be in the next census. But the point is that no religion group is growing and is quite visible and vocal in the Republic of Ireland as well. To compare to that, religious identification in Northern Ireland between 1968 and 2018, so a measure of different surveys used here. You can see Catholic identification, and then it's broken down by the various Protestant denominations as well. I'll just make a quick commentary on that. You can see there's greater overall decline within Protestantism. And Catholicism tends to stay a bit more stable. This is partly demographic in that overall the population of people from Catholic backgrounds is holding steady, where it's declining of people from Protestant backgrounds as well. So it's partly demographic. But again, there's the column as well for no religion. And you can see that really growing in Northern Ireland about from less than 1% in 1968 down to 17% in 2018. And it's kind of hovering between 17 and 19% in the most recent Northern Ireland Life and Times surveys. And most of the growth in no religion comes from people of Protestant backgrounds. So those are the kind of the religious identification trends, people who are willing to say, well, yes, I belong to this religion or not. Mass attendance, again, just to give you a sense of the decline of that, a few figures plucked for you from Ireland between 1972 2016. The early figure from 1972 is weekly. The later figures are monthly. The 36% is from the European Social Survey, and I'm using that 2016 figure because I'll compare it to other European countries later on in the presentation. My sense now is a few years on from 2016 that mass attendance is lower. So recent surveys that the Iona Institute have done, for instance, are getting about 27% of people being monthly mass goers. So I tend to think it's more likely around that range. And there's also big differences between urban and rural locations in terms of mass attendance. Church attendance in Northern Ireland, 1968-2019. Again, you can see the declines for weekly, and then from 1998, I give monthly figures. The Catholic mass attendance was very high, obviously 95% in 1968. It's now monthly, about 46%. Protestantism also has declined, not as much, but from a lower base, as you can see. So a huge drop off really in mass attendance, but still higher than the Republic, both amongst Catholics and Protestants. So going back to what Andrew said earlier about Northern Ireland being more religiously practicing, you can see that borne out in these figures. Other indicators of decline, drop in vocations to the priesthood and the clergy. Important to mention that Ireland was once one of the world's largest exporters of priests, I suppose, and now are struggling to have enough priests to service the Catholic Church. Religion amongst people under 30. These people, both North and South, are more likely to identify as having no religion. They're less likely to practice. So there's a generational effect in that the bottom of Ireland's relatively high levels of church attendance could fall away very quickly when these generational cohorts move up. Decreased social influence, this has been alluded to. Some of the referenda in the Republic on same-sex marriage, abortion, etc., indicate that weakened influence of the Catholic Church on social policy, and also is indicative of the weakened relationship with political power, and that is the case both North and South, although there are some differences. I think that the churches in the North have better access to politicians and perhaps better are listened to maybe a bit more or interacted with in a more constructive is probably the wrong word, but there's a bit different level of interaction, I think, between church leaders in the North than there is in the South, and the church concerns, I think, are taken more seriously in the North amongst politicians. And some of my research more recently talks about that as well. Religion is a shaper of identity. These are some of the qualitative indicators of decline. I'll just mention a couple books. I won't read these slides because I know we're a bit pressed for time here. But Tom Inglis's recent book on meanings of contemporary life in Ireland. So this would be the Republic. And he talks about how other sources of meaning, like place and family, money and success, politics, sport, and love, are just much more important to people now than Catholicism. And a very powerful quote from that book: there were very few indications that God was in their minds and hearts or on their lips. This is a major social study. Jennifer Todd's book on identity change after conflict. This is a qualitative study that again shows the greater salience of religion on the northern side of the border rather than the south. So the declines have happened very quickly, particularly since the 1990s. That's, I suppose, a key decade, really. And Marie-Nicola Podrick writes about this, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, the extent of the most recent levels of decline post-1998. Many of you will recognize that as the date of the peace agreement. She calls this the crossing of a new threshold, perhaps comparable to the projected melting of the polar ice cap. So if you think back to some of those figures and seeing this steep decline since the 1990s, this seems to be almost a new phenomenon, really. In Crawford's book, he calls it, especially in the Republic, sudden onset secularization, what happened here in the 1990s. Some of the reasons for this post-1998, I say, could be just the 1990s, particularly when I'm talking about the impact of clerical abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, both North and South. There's been wee bits of research done here and there that would indicate that this has affected people's levels of practice and trust in the Church. The impact of the Troubles ending, I think that has had an impact on declines in church attendance as well. I'm not going along with the, that idea that religion was just a proxy for national identity, but there are other sociological theories like Inglehart's work on existential security. In societies that are less secure, people are more likely to be religious practicing. And I think it fits in with that and explains partially some of the decline since, the Troubles have ended. And then, of course, there's always the wider context of European processes of modernization, secularization, and economic growth, which is particularly important in the Republic with the Celtic Tiger and so forth. But still, we need to keep in mind, European average church attendance is 13%. So that's from the 2016 European Social Survey. So Ireland's levels of attendance are still very high compared to the rest of Europe. So we don't want to fall into the sociological and I suppose ecclesial trap as well of equating religious vitality with institutional identification and practice either. So there are other ways people practice their religion that aren't necessarily captured by these statistics. So I want to talk briefly about a few of those. Now, Crawford mentioned the Pope's visit as an example of how far Catholicism had fallen, right? And to some extent, I think it does confirm that. So I commissioned a survey of the population, a representative of the population in the Republic after the Pope's visit. And we asked, people who didn't go, why didn't you go? 50% simply said they weren't interested. About 30% said they didn't go because they were dissatisfied with the way the church had handled the abuse scandals and so forth. So that's interesting, but also interesting, that survey, I found some evidence that most people thought Francis didn't do enough to address abuse during his visit, but there was a Francis effect amongst the sizable minority. And by Francis effect, I mean a slightly more positive view of the church, so maybe indicating a potential bit of vitality. So 39% of people who practiced Catholicism and 15% of people who identified as Catholic but didn't really practice have a more favorable view of the church since Francis took office. Other indicators of religious persistence and vitality. Again, I mentioned still leading the way in Europe. And then in the book here that I wrote, Transforming Post-Catholic Ireland, I talked about the people who practice extra-institutional religion. So quite a few people no longer would identify with the institutional churches, particularly the Catholic Church, and they're finding, I suppose, new ways outside the institutions of the church or in addition to the institution of the church to live their faith in a vibrant way. So this sense that the institutions aren't fit for purpose, but lay people are kind of doing it on their own, comes through very much in this research, much of which was qualitative based on interviews and so forth. I'll mention COVID-19 briefly. And this has changed religious practice. So one of the most obvious is that all churches nearly have some sort of online provision now. I did a survey of faith leaders in May 2020 and also found some evidence of increased volunteerism amongst lay people and a significant level of interchurch engagement at the national level. The Northern Ireland Life and Times survey asked a question about this. Interestingly, found greater online engagements among Protestants than Catholic people. But at the same time, Iona Institute has been doing polls in the Republic of Ireland as well. And amongst those who haven't returned to Mass yet, 1/5 say they don't know if they ever will. So this, I think, points to maybe the fragility, particularly of Catholicism in the South. If 1 in 5 people who haven't come back to Mass don't know if they ever will, has the pandemic been a catalyst for, accelerating the declines in church attendance? So the future, I'm going to wrap up now. When Ryan opened, he started with a reference to this church leaders service in Armagh, which I blogged about there on Slugger O'Toole. And during the last few days, what contributions can churches make to the future? Well, the church leaders group pictured here tried to make a contribution around engaging with the decade of centenaries, and you can debate how successful that engagement has been. I think churches, though, need to regain legitimacy. Will they acknowledge their own roles in contributing to violence and creating cultures of abuse? And some of the church's positions also seem increasingly out of step, particularly around LGBTQ+ issues. How does that impact their social role? Redefining societal roles as well. How will the church's roles in education, North and South, change? Their churches have a lot of control of education. That's being increasingly questioned. And so to return to something that Andrew mentioned, I think looking to the future, we have to look at the importance of laity in terms of keeping the church going, especially going, and that I think will become an increasingly lay church as vocations decline. So that is another trend for the future, I suppose. So I will wrap it up there and let Ryan take us away for the next part. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. That was really fantastic, and apologies for not introducing you. I thought Andrew did so eloquently, so I thought I could just let it run in. So yeah, thanks everyone for some really stimulating talks. I think it was really interesting, especially linking Crawford and Andrew's talks into the 1980s with your study of recent trends, and especially trends that may be accelerating in the last year or so due to COVID. I think we have Crawford for another 5 minutes if he's still here. So if we can start. We'll have a few questions. If any questions come, just pop them in the chat and we can discuss them. But I'll start with one very, very broad question because that's, I think, where all of these roundtable discussions should start, an impossibly broad question. So this is from Bernard Malloy from Monaghan, and he asked, basically, was partition and the development of the sectarian divide on the island of Ireland, was it inevitable or could it have been avoided? That's yes, a very broad question as I mentioned, but just thinking about how the sectarianism we probably associate with Northern Ireland at the moment, was that development of that inevitable?
One for Andrew, maybe.
Thanks. Is that me lying under a bus? Thank you very much. I suppose, speaking as a historian, I would, if there's a fence, I'll sit on it as a historian. I think one thing I'm sort of allergic to ideas of inevitability because people do make decisions in real time. And certainly in terms of thinking about the differences between Protestants and Catholics over the last 200-300 years, it hasn't always been like that, and there have been peaks and troughs in that. I'm teaching a course at the moment on 19th century Ireland, and the striking thing about most of the 19th century in Ireland is that nobody's really talking that much about the constitutional question, and that there are other ways of thinking about politics, and that whenever we think about other ways of doing politics, about sewerage and land reform and things like that. There are ways that different groups of Christians can work together to achieve practical political aims. So it's the constitutional question in many ways that actually leads to the polarisation of Ireland. And I suppose from that perspective, the partition of Ireland was a pragmatic political response to a political problem. Whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing, of course, is for the audience to decide. But I think I would try to be a bit more, see how things develop over time, and that there's not necessarily always a continuum of Protestant versus Catholic, but that it waxes and wanes according to circumstances.
Maybe, Ryan, if I could just add to that, I think it's important to remember that sectarianism, however you define it, predates partition. And it's certainly not created by it. And, you know, the further you go back into the 19th, into the 18th, into the 17th century, what's striking there is that there is much competition between Protestants and other kinds of Protestants, as there is between Protestants and Catholics. And I think it's, Andrew can correct me, but I think it's probably true to say that it's really only towards the end of the 19th century that Protestants really do believe they've got everything in common with each other and not very much in common with the kind of sectarian other that their politics is so often addressing.
And I'll just be very brief and say, I don't think anything is inevitable. And I think that goes along with what Andrew and Crawford had said as well.
Yeah, I think that's a dirty word for many people, inevitable. I think, Crawford, what you've mentioned about like how we view sectarianism, I think it is an interesting one, where sectarianism is not just between Protestants and Catholics, it can be within Protestantism. And you see, we talk about especially the late 19th century as a kind of consolidation of these Protestants as under a broad political banner, unionism against Catholic nationalism. And while you look across the water at Scotland, if you look at the term sectarianism in newspapers or pamphlets, it refers to the battles, not figurative battles between Presbyterians even, never mind Protestants or Catholics. So it is interesting how we view sectarianism, how it develops, and how it's not just a foregone conclusion that's going to be between Protestants and Catholics. But as you say, Crawford, that kind of political consolidation by the end of the 19th century, especially going into the Home Rule crises, solidifies that in Ireland anyway. Yeah. Another question, kind of broad one, touching upon what Andrew discussed about putting like the religious back into religious history, and kind of going against the tyranny of the constitutional question. And it was Susan Hickey, whose husband John published Religion in Northern Ireland in 1984, and she says that many sociologists, as you comment on this, felt religion was not important enough to examine the impact. Why do you think, just in general, in kind of a general kind of way, that the churches, the role of the churches, the role of religion in general, is kind of not avoided, but more set aside in kind of histories of Northern Ireland and histories of Ireland, or in all studies of Ireland? Do you think that is the case?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I think that for a period, sociologists in particular were very captive to the theory of secularization, and this idea that religion would decline inevitably almost, and that's putting a very stark play. I mean, no one thought it was inevitable, right? Because we just said nothing's inevitable, but there was an assumption, I think, that secularization theory just meant that religion wasn't that important, And a generation ago, that was, particularly when John Hickey was writing, that was an assumption. So he was kind of going against that, And some of the best studies of Northern Ireland, even say like McGarry and O'Leary stuff, just kind of dismiss religion as an ethnic marker and no more than that. And Claire Mitchell, who was a sociologist at Queen's, did really great work in trying to debunk that. Her book, The Religion, Identity and Politics in Northern Ireland, looked at various ways that religion matters functionally, socially and politically and so forth. And she kind of helped get the ball rolling in terms of looking at the different ways religion has mattered in Northern Ireland. I think sociologically we are in a much better place now with people like Claire Mitchell, John Brewer, and I've tried to contribute to that as well. and showing how religion does matter. It's not the only explanatory variable. It works in concert with other variables, but I think it's, we have regained some ground, I suppose, in trying to make religion's role more appreciated, I suppose, in the way it has contributed to divisions and sectarianism, and also its role in the peace process as well.
Yeah, no, I would echo what Gladys says. I think there's also a sense as well that during the Troubles, people were trying to find answers to the problem, and from that perspective, trying to think about the constitutional question or class as a factor, or national identity as a factor in conflict. It's easier for people to get their heads around that. And in many ways, the event last week of the church service in Armagh, as Malky O'Doherty wrote in the Belfast Telegraph yesterday, raises a really important and big question. If the Northern Ireland conflict wasn't about religion, well then, why were the churches beating themselves up about not being agents of reconciliation if religion wasn't the answer? So it's a complex relationship. I suppose, from my perspective, I'm a historian of religion, and I'm interested in how people practice their religion, how they think about science and religion, or think about economics and religion. It's not just about the constitutional question that I'm interested in. So from that point of view, I have a slightly different way of maybe thinking about religion than maybe historians or political scientists of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I would just add a footnote to both those excellent contributions and say that the rediscovery of religion is probably related to the collapse of Marxism and the influence of Marxism in arts and humanities, social science research. When I started out in the 1990s reading historical stuff, Marxism was still quite strong. In the 1990s, I think that changes, and people are more alert to religion as a phenomena in itself rather than as a language for more real issues like class or economics.
And I think Susan's added in the chat there was also a time in the 1980s, at the time John Hickey's book, that economic determinism was the main thrust in sociology. So yeah, just a question maybe directed more at your talk, Crawford. Charles Glenn has asked that he understood that it was private consultants rather than GPs who mobilised the bishops in opposition to the mother and baby scheme. Is this correct, or was their role still there or less important?
I'll need to go and check, Ryan. I thought it was for GPs, but I might be wrong. Either way, it was the medical fraternity against the government with the bishops on their side. But yeah, I'll go and check on that.
Thanks, Crawford. Just a general question, I think, building on Gladys, what you said about the recent impact of COVID-19 and the move to online services and mass. Why do you think it is, you touched upon this, but why do you think it is that Protestants have been more likely to embrace the new online version of worship that's become prevalent?
Right, well, let's say I don't have representative data for this, right? The Life and Times survey just asked a very, basic question about how often people had tuned in online, and there was very clear differences. Protestants were doing a lot more. Some of my speculative hypotheses that would need to be fleshed out with actual good research, right, are that I think perhaps the Protestant form of a service with the preaching as the main element, perhaps that works better online than maybe the Catholic model, which is more Eucharistic, and receiving the Eucharist is the major element. And I suppose it also should be said, the Catholic bishops came out and said that the obligation to attend Sunday Mass was suspended, right? So that may also have something to do with it. And it's related to that, the bishops also encouraged people to do acts of spiritual communion. So particularly during COVID, when you couldn't go to church or receive Eucharist, if you watched along, you could theoretically experience a spiritual communion while not receiving the bread. But whether or not that was, I suppose, fulfilling a Catholic's spiritual needs, I'm not sure. But what we would need to do is investigate this more empirically. But those are some of my speculative hypotheses, I suppose.
Thanks. to kind of build upon that speculative character of what you're doing, because we're obviously talking about, you mentioned about this kind of element of maybe people not going back post-COVID. First of all, two questions. Is that across the board, and could that be seen as an even further accelerant of the kind of, because I think one of the most striking images used in the slides and the presentations was Crawford using the image of Pope Francis's visit and the empty space, you know, in Phoenix Park compared to Pope John Paul's. So I think, is that do you think that these are just kind of, you know, accelerating a current trend, or do you think COVID has had like a very outlier kind of impact on attendance?
Well, I mean, when you say outlier impact in accelerating a trend, that's, to me, that's almost nearly the same thing, because COVID is such an outlier, and you know, this idea that it maybe is accelerating a trend. I think that is the data that I have and that I quoted is only for mass-going Catholics in the Republic of Ireland. Okay, we don't really have the same questions haven't been asked in the north. So I think that it is accelerating a trend in the south of this declining mass attendance. I think a lot of people went out of habit and maybe will just not go back. You know, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church, and I don't think it will take much for many people just to stop attending as well. But yet at the same time, some of the other research on religion in the pandemic, you know, it's a crisis, right? It's an existential crisis. Some people are turning back as well now. I don't know if this can offset, right? But one of the other things that came out in the question that was asked on the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, now this is just Northern Ireland data, about 9% of people who identified as either Catholic or Protestant were tuning into online stuff more than they wouldn't have gone to church previously. So they were actually more religious during the pandemic than they were before the pandemic. So you've got contrary trends, really. So I guess the picture is a bit complicated, and we don't really have the data to make sure pronouncements about it.
Just to kind of build upon that, and perhaps as a fine, if nobody has any further questions that they might want to bring up, I kind of just to build upon what you're talking about there. What do you see? So we've talked about the past 100 years of Christianity in Ireland. What's the future for Christianity in Ireland?
I don't want to hog this. I know if Crawford has speculated about the future in his book. Will I give you the first go at that?
Oh, you go first, Gladys. You go first. You're more informed. I just speculate.
Well, in a sense, social scientists don't make predictions, right? That's what we always say. But I mean, I think that the trend is declining vocations, and it's maybe overall societal decline of influence and so forth. But I think you will have I don't want to use the word remnant, but there will still be a kind of a core that's practicing. So you're going to get a conservative core, and Crawford actually talks quite a bit about this in the last chapter of his book, of both conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics. So that conservative core will remain. Something Crawford doesn't talk so much about in the book is the liberal or the moderate people who will remain. And I think they're the folks who in my book, Transforming Post-Catholic Ireland, I call the extra institutionals. I think those folks will come up with creative ways to practice their faith. How much it aligns with the institutions we have right now really depends on if the institutions can reform themselves and take the views of those people on board, especially women. So, I mean, in some ways it's all to play for, you know. You could have like a total collapse with a conservative core left, or, you know, you could have a churches that reform themselves and make constructive contributions to people's spiritual lives and so forth. Not that the conservative groups don't do that. They do, actually. A lot of those people have very rich spiritual lives. So I don't want to make it sound like that. But a lot, really, I suppose, depends on the agency of people themselves and the way the institutions respond to the challenges.
I think that's a very good answer. I think it's a difficult question to answer, Ryan, because obviously we're thinking about how churches will change, but churches will change in a changing context, and so society is going to change around them. And Gladys mentioned there that one of the challenges, strokes, opportunities that churches need to think now is about how they deal with being out of step with wider society on several key issues. So, I think that there will be a large, probably the majority of church attenders now, however you define church attenders after just talking about decline, who will probably find themselves in denominations that cautiously, but inevitably, there's that word again, track social change. But I mean, I'm much more interested in thinking about the people who want to retain some kind of traditional sense of piety or ethics or morality, and who will do that despite what I anticipate will be increasing pressure from society and even from mainstream churches to stop doing that and to sort of get up to speed. So I'm kind of curious to see what will happen there. I was going to say something else. We've actually forgotten what it was. But anyway, I think that was the sort of gist of what I was going to say. So I'm maybe a bit less optimistic than Gladys is that churches will find a way of remaining relevant. I think they're probably not going to remain relevant.
Yeah, I just to echo a point that Gladys made earlier on, that the decline of denominations is a different thing to the decline of religion and how people think about these things. And it seems to me that certainly in terms of traditional denominations, they are under serious threat in terms of their role as spokespersons for their flock. And I think there's a real, in some ways the conservative term in amongst the churches in recent years is as much a function of the loss of that sense of status and authority which they once had to speak for their community. So it's interesting because it does raise really big questions about what the church is, what the institution is, what the denomination is, and how that relates to the local parish, the local congregation, or whatever it might be. So it'd be very interesting to see how those things work out over the next 10 to 20 years, and the extent to which denominations will be able in any way to pivot positively towards those changes.
Go ahead, Crawford.
Sorry, Ryan, I remember what I was going to say. So basically what I was going to say was that Irish churches have always changed. Mm-hmm. So, we shouldn't think that here's this sort of static religious culture which all of a sudden has to lurch towards something else. The things that we sort of take for granted today as conservative religion, whether it's, weekly mass attendance or whatever the evangelical equivalent of that might be. The sort of revivalistic piety within evangelicalism, these are sort of mid-19th century inventions. Every change has got its own history, and I think it's just another one of those.
I think that's a nice way to end our session tonight, and a bit more upbeat, Crawford, than your earlier point. So I think I'd like to thank, first of all, I'd like to thank Ganiel and everyone at the Nerve Centre for organising this event tonight, and I would like to thank everybody for coming along and sharing your own insights and questions, and finally to the panel for coming up with some fantastically stimulating talks and discussion points. So I'd like to thank everybody, and thanks for tuning in, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much to all the speakers. It was really, really insightful, and it was great to hear your discussions at the end as well. Just would like to say, if anyone has a moment, could they please fill out the post-event evaluation form? And that's the last time I will plug that. So thank you very much. It was great. Lovely to meet you all. Bye.
Thank you.